Okay, here we are again, and here's our next section of the tools behind the trade. In my hands here, I have artist quality Arches paper. I have 3 different types of textures. The pink one over here is hot pressed. The green one in the middle is cold pressed. This little sucker over here, it's the rough. Now what that means is it's the physical texture on the paper. Let's talk about the hot press first. In your mind, I want you to imagine an iron. So when this paper is made, just like an iron, a hot iron presses your shirts, this is put through rollers that are really hot, and it presses the paper so it has a very smooth, polished finish. Now what that means as far as painting texture to paint on is that it's a little bit harder to blend out your transitions. You'll find that paintings painted on a hot press paper will have a lot more linear aspects to how the washes dry. It's sometimes not as easy to lift the paint off of the paper afterwards. And truly, a lot of artists find that hot press paper is maybe a little bit more suited towards doing drawings, pen and ink, washes with ink, that sort of stuff, and it's just absolutely beautiful. In fact, this is one of my absolute favorite drawing papers for charcoal, graphite, you name it, even pencil crayon. This is our hot pressed. Cold press. Cold press. So now I want you to imagine that these rollers that the paper is put through, to squish it through so it makes it thin paper, these rollers are now cold. Now, one step beyond that is cold press, as well as rough paper, has a very special technique that's put on top of it. Meaning, each brand that makes this paper has their own special piece of felt. Now, if you imagine felt, when it's pressed into this paper, it makes a texture on it. Now, the cold pressing through here, the texture of the felt is not as textured as our good old buddy over here. This rough paper has a lot of texture on it, so it has a very different felt. Now, when you go between brands of paper, what makes them unique is the texture on the paper. So each brand will have its own special unique recipe for a piece of felt. But it makes the paint react differently. Cold press. Now, if you're a beginner and if you're just starting out, I'd really recommend go the middle of the road and experiment on 140-pound cold press paper. It's a great way to just get the feeling of watercolor paper. Cold press paper, when you're painting, because the texture on it, the paint and the water will absorb into the paper on different sides. So you'll find it's a little bit easier to do smoother transitions. When it dries, sometimes you'll still get some hard edges around the paint washes, but you can manipulate it and control it a little bit better. You can also lift out on this paper. Now, if you don't know what that means, I think maybe I need to do a beginner watercolor video. So you can lift out by using a brush or a paper towel or anything else, and it will give you different visual effects. So cold press paper is probably the most, I don't want to say valued, but a lot of artists tend to go for the cold press paper. It's really, really nice to work with. Our friend, the rough paper. This texture, this felt that's been pressed into this is pretty textured. Now, if you imagine all these little bumps and wiggles, think of them as peaks and valleys of the paper. So when you're painting your paint across, sometimes how the paint absorbs into these peaks and valleys will be different. Now, rough paper, because it has so many exposed edges of the texture of the paper, it's really like a big sponge. So this is the type of paper that when you're painting on it, the paint will cast out. So you tend to get a lot of soft edges, a lot of soft transitions. And in some people's opinion, maybe too many. But I tell you right now, this type of paper, it's great for anything that you want to do texture on. You can do dry brushing techniques and make fantastic bark, or texture on rocks, which is great, and you just skip and jump over the surface of that texture. So it's something to definitely play around with. If you're new to watercolor, as I said, 140-pound cold press, start there. Once you're gonna get to the point of just wanting to experiment more, try a hot press, try a rough. Figure this out, because paper texture is just as unique as the brands that make them. So try different brands as well, because you're gonna be so surprised at just how your paint reacts differently just from choosing a piece of paper.